The perfect plan the Empire's greatest minds, Supreme War Architect Zextar, stood before the massive crystalline display that dominated the command center of the Vorthic Empire's greatest dreadnought. 10,000 years of careful planning had led to this moment. Around him, hundreds of the galaxy's most brilliant military minds worked at their stations, each one a master of warfare who had conquered entire star systems. The Vorthic were not a species that acted on impulse. Every decision was calculated. Every strategy perfected through centuries of analysis. The display showed a small blue world orbiting an unremarkable yellow star in the outer rim of the galaxy. Earth, home to the creatures called humans. To most species in the galaxy, it would seem like an insignificant target. But Zextar knew better. This planet contained resources that could fuel the Vorthic Empire for millennia. More importantly, it would serve as the perfect demonstration of Vorthic superiority to the other advanced civilizations who dared to question their power. The Vorthic themselves were an impressive sight. Standing nearly 3 meters tall, their bodies were covered in metallic scales that had been bioengineered for maximum efficiency. 4 arms extended from their torso, each one capable of precise manipulation or devastating combat. Their heads were elongated, housing brains that had been enhanced through genetic modification for 10,000 generations. They were, by every measure, the perfect warrior species. But their greatest strength was not their physical capabilities. It was their patience. Where other species might spend decades planning a conquest, the Vorthic spent centuries. Where others might gather intelligence. For years, the Vorthic observed for millennia. They had been watching Earth since humans were barely more than primitive hunters, gathering around fires. 10 millennia of observation. The data they had collected was staggering. Hidden observation posts scattered throughout Earth's solar system had recorded every major event in human history. They had witnessed the rise and fall of empires, the development of technology, the evolution of human warfare. Every battle had been analyzed, every weapon catalogued, every tactical doctrine dissected by Vorthic military scientists. The humans were fascinating in their primitive way. They were physically weak, with fragile bones and soft flesh. Their lifespans were incredibly short by galactic standards. They fought among themselves constantly, wasting resources on internal conflicts instead of uniting against external threats. Their technology was crude and inefficient. Most telling of all, they seemed incapable of long-term planning, making decisions based on emotion rather than logic. Display the human military assessment. Zextar commanded. The crystalline screen shifted to show detailed analyses of human armed forces. Every army, navy, and air force on the planet had been studied in minute detail. The Vorthic knew the location of every military base, the specifications of every weapon, the training regimen of every soldier. They had infiltrated human communication networks and decoded every military protocol. The assessment was clear. Human militaries were designed to fight other humans. Their weapons were optimized for conflicts within their own atmosphere and gravity. Their tactics were based on territorial disputes and resource competition. They had no experience fighting an enemy with superior technology, no protocols for dealing with attacks from space, no concept of the kind of warfare the Vorthic would bring to their world. Even more encouraging was human psychology. According to Vorthic behavioral analysts, humans became irrational when faced with overwhelming force. They panicked, made poor decisions, and often turned on each other instead of working together. Their leaders were selected through popularity contests rather than competence. Their populations were soft, accustomed to comfort and safety. The first sign of real danger would cause their entire civilization to collapse into chaos. The perfect trap, but Zextar was too experienced to rely on analysis alone. A Vorthic had prepared for every contingency. Their invasion fleet consisted of 3,000 ships, each one carrying weapons that could devastate continents. The smallest Vorthic fighter craft was more advanced than anything humans had ever built. Their ground forces wore armor that could withstand nuclear weapons. Their shields could deflect any projectile in the human arsenal. More importantly, they had prepared for the psychological aspect of the conquest. Vorthic scientists had developed weapons designed specifically to break human morale. Fear generators that could trigger panic in entire populations. Mind control devices that could turn human leaders into puppets. Memory erasers that could make entire cities forget they had ever been free. The invasion plan itself was a masterpiece of military strategy. Phase 1 would eliminate all human military capabilities within the first hour. Orbital strikes would destroy every major military installation simultaneously. Communication networks would be jammed, preventing coordination between remaining forces. Leadership bunkers would be targeted specifically, decapitating human command structures before they could respond. Phase 2 would focus on population centers. Massive displays of force would be staged over every major city. The humans would see Vorthic ships filling their skies, demonstrating the futility of resistance. At the same time, broadcasts would be transmitted in every human language, offering terms of surrender. Those who complied would be treated as valuable resources. Those who resisted would be eliminated. Phase 3 would establish permanent occupation. Vorthic administrators would replace human governments. The most intelligent humans would be selected for specialized roles, serving the Empire in exchange for preferential treatment. The rest would be assigned to resource extraction and infrastructure maintenance. Within a generation, human children would grow up knowing no other reality than service to the Vorthic Empire. The fleet prepares. As the invasion fleet made its final approach to Earth, Zextar reviewed the intelligence reports one final time. Everything was proceeding exactly as predicted. Human detection systems were primitive enough that the fleet remained completely invisible. Their military forces were deployed according to patterns the Vorthic had observed for centuries. Their leaders were following behavioral profiles that had been established through decades of psychological analysis. The ground commanders reported their readiness. General Korthax, veteran of 47 successful conquests, would lead the assault on the North American military installations. Admiral Vexenal, whose strategies had brought down the Centauri defense network, would coordinate the attacks on human naval forces. Wing Commander Yulter, who had perfected the art of psychological warfare, would handle the civilian populations. Each commander had trained their forces specifically for this mission. Vorthic soldiers had practiced fighting in Earth's gravity, breathing Earth's atmosphere, and dealing with Earth's climate variations. They had studied human anatomy to learn the most efficient ways to disable or eliminate resistance. They had learned basic human languages to facilitate the post-conquest occupation. But most importantly, they had been prepared for the easiest victory in Vorthic history. Every simulation had shown the same result. Human resistance would collapse within hours, possibly minutes. The conquest of Earth would be so swift and overwhelming that other galactic civilizations would abandon any thoughts of opposing the Vorthic Empire. The moment of truth. All fleets report ready status. Hanley. Communication from the Fleet Coordination Center got ZEX single quotes. Tar allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. 10,000 years of preparation were about to pay off. The humans below had no idea what was coming. In a few minutes, their entire world would change forever. They would go from being an independent species to being a conquered population, serving the greatest empire in galactic history. Begin Phase 1, he commanded. Across Earth's orbit, Vorthic ships decloaked simultaneously. The invasion of Earth had begun. Thousands of vessels appeared in the skies over every major population center. Orbital bombardment platforms targeted military installations with surgical precision. Dropships launched toward their designated landing zones. Communication jamming systems activated, severing human command networks. Everything proceeded exactly according to plan. Human radar systems detected the invasion fleet exactly 4.7 seconds after decloaking, precisely as Vorthik calculations had predicted. Military bases began broadcasting emergency alerts, following communication protocols that the Vorthik had studied for decades. Fighter aircraft scrambled from airfields, launching with exactly the response time and formation patterns that Vorthik analysts had documented. The first human weapons fired at Vorthik ships 67 seconds after the initial detection. Missiles launched from ground installations, fighter craft, and naval vessels. Every projectile followed ballistic paths that Vorthik computers had calculated in advance. Point defense systems intercepted the incoming weapons with perfect accuracy. Not a single human attack reached its target. Meanwhile, Vorthik weapons began eliminating human military capabilities with devastating efficiency. Orbital strikes vaporized command centers. Pulse weapons disabled communication arrays. Electromagnetic bombs shut down power grids. Within 2 minutes of the attack beginning, human military forces were blind, deaf, and largely helpless. The first sign of trouble asterisk. But then something unexpected happened. In a small town called Riverside, Montana, the local Vorthik ground forces encountered something that didn't match any of their intelligence reports. A group of human children had been playing in a park when the invasion began. According to all Vorthik behavioral models, young humans should have fled in terror or hidden until adults could protect them. Instead, the children surrounded the landing Vorthik dropship and started throwing rocks at it, not in panic or fear, but with what appeared to be organized tactical coordination. They had somehow identified the ship's sensor arrays and were specifically targeting them with remarkable accuracy for beings with such primitive throwing abilities. Leader Nex Valoom reported the incident to his commander. The juvenile humans are not exhibiting predicted fear responses. They appear to be treating our arrival as some form of competitive activity. Irrelevant, came the response. Continue with pacification protocols. But as reports flooded in from ground teams around the world, a disturbing pattern began to emerge. Humans were not behaving according to any of the models that had been developed during 10,000 years of observation. In Tokyo, elderly humans practicing some form of slow-motion exercise had somehow managed to redirect Vorthik energy weapons back at their operators. In London, a gathering of humans watching some kind of tribal competition had spontaneously organized into a coordinated assault force. In Sydney, a single human female with a small child had disabled an entire Vorthik reconnaissance team using nothing but garden equipment. Zextar reviewed the incoming reports with growing confusion. Everything was going wrong, but not in any way that made sense. The humans weren't mounting organized military resistance. They weren't following any recognizable tactical doctrines. They weren't even acting afraid. Instead, they seemed to be improvising responses that defied all logic and yet somehow proved remarkably effective against Vorthik forces. How is this possible? He demanded of his intelligence staff. The answer would prove to be the Vorthik Empire's greatest oversight in 10,000 years of careful planning. Asterisk humanity's impossible victory. Unthinkable happens 3 minutes into what should have been the most successful invasion in galactic history. Zextar received a report that defied all logic. "Sir," his communications officer said, his voice tight with disbelief, "Ground Team 7 is requesting immediate extraction." Extraction? Zextar's 4 eyes narrowed. From what? According to their report, they are being overwhelmed by human children armed with water-based projectile weapons. Zextar stared at the communications console. In 40 years of military service, across dozens of conquered worlds, He had never heard anything so ridiculous. Vorthik soldiers were equipped with armor that could withstand direct hits from starship weapons. Their training regimen lasted decades. Each warrior was worth 100 of any other species fighters. "Clarify that report," he commanded. "Sir?" Ground Team 7 landed at coordinates designated as a human military training facility. Upon arrival, they discovered it was actually a recreational gathering of juvenile humans. "The humans have surrounded our forces and are using some form of chemical warfare that interferes with our equipment sensors." Across the bridge, other communication stations began lighting up with similar reports. In New York, a Vorthik strike team had been defeated by humans throwing food items from elevated positions. In Paris, Vorthik forces were retreating from what appeared to be a coordinated assault by civilian musicians using sonic weapons. In Mumbai, a single human grandmother had somehow convinced an entire Vorthik squad to surrender by offering them homemade food. But the most disturbing report came from Berlin, where Vorthik forces had encountered something their analysts had never predicted. A group of human engineers had spent exactly 90 seconds analyzing captured Vorthik technology before figuring out how to reverse its polarity and turn it into a defensive weapon. They were now using Vorthik energy shields to create an impenetrable barrier around their city. The human factor wing commander Yulter's voice crackled over the communication system, and for the first time in his career, he sounded panicked. "Supreme War Architect, I need to report a complete failure of psychological warfare protocols." "Explain," Zextar demanded. "Sir, our fear generation weapons have had the opposite of their intended effect. Instead of causing humans to flee in terror, they appear to be making the humans angrier and more coordinated. In Los Angeles, our psychological assault has caused the entire population to unite against us. They have somehow weaponized their transportation vehicles and are using them as guided missiles against our landing craft. This was impossible. Vorthik psychological weapons had been tested on dozens of species across the galaxy. Fear was a universal constant. All intelligent beings, when faced with overwhelming terror, would either flee or freeze. It was a basic survival instinct hardwired into every evolved consciousness, except apparently in humans. "Sir," another communications officer called out, "Admiral Vexino is reporting total failure of naval operations. The humans have somehow trained marine animals to attack our underwater installations." "That's impossible," Zextar replied. "No species has ever successfully weaponized planetary wildlife." According to the Admiral's report, human marine biologists have convinced dolphins to carry explosive devices, trained whales to ram our submarines, and taught sharks to target our underwater sensors. The Admiral says it's like the entire ocean has turned against us. But even that paled in comparison to what was happening in rural areas. Farmer John Mackenzie in Kansas had looked at the Vorthik dropship that landed in his cornfield, walked to his barn, retrieved something called a combine harvester, and proceeded to chase the alien craft across 3 counties. A massive agricultural machine designed for harvesting crops had somehow been modified in real time to shoot corn kernels with enough velocity to damage Vorthik armor dot in Australia. Sheep ranchers had organized their flocks into a coordinated assault force. Thousands of woolly animals were stampeding across the landscape, overwhelming Vorthik ground positions through sheer numbers and completely unexpected tactics. The Vorthik had prepared for human military resistance, civilian panic, and even guerrilla warfare. They had never considered the possibility of being defeated by livestock. The 5-minute mark, as the invasion entered its 5th minute, something unprecedented happened in the history of the Vorthik Empire. Supreme War Architect Zextar, commander of the greatest military force in the galaxy, issued an order he had never given before. All forces implement emergency withdrawal protocols. The bridge fell silent. In 10,000 years of Vorthic military history, no invasion fleet had ever been ordered to retreat. The Vorthic didn't retreat. They conquered, occupied, and controlled. Withdrawal was not a concept that existed in their strategic doctrine. "Sir," General Korth-Ax's voice came over the communication system. "Did you say withdrawal?" "You heard." "Correctly, General. All forces are to return to their ships immediately and prepare for emergency jump to hyperspace." "But sir, we haven't even deployed our main battle forces." "This is just a minor setback with the advanced scouts." Zexstar looked at the tactical display showing Vorthic positions around the globe. Red indicators marked failed missions, overwhelmed units, and requests for extraction. In 5 minutes, the most powerful military force in galactic history had been reduced to scattered, confused groups of soldiers being defeated by children, farmers, musicians, and marine biologists. "General," Zexstar said quietly, "in the past 5 minutes, we have lost more equipment and personnel than in our last 3 major conquest campaigns combined. Our psychological warfare has backfired completely. Our technological superiority has been neutralized by human adaptability. Our strategic advantages have been turned against us by human creativity." He paused, trying to process what he was about. To say, the humans aren't just winning. They're learning faster than we can adapt. Every new tactic we employ, they counter within minutes. Every weakness they discover, they exploit immediately. "General, in 5 minutes of combat, the humans have demonstrated tactical innovation that surpasses anything in our 10,000 years of military experience." The impossible truth as Vorthic ships began their emergency ascent from Earth's atmosphere. Zexstar finally understood the fatal flaw in their 10 millennia of planning. They had studied human warfare, but they had only observed humans fighting other humans. They had analyzed human behavior, but only human behavior within the constraints of human society and human expectations. Asterisk. What they had never witnessed was how humans behaved when faced with something completely outside their experience. They had never seen human creativity unleashed against an external threat. They had never observed human adaptability when survival was at stake. Most importantly, they had never understood that human unpredictability wasn't a weakness to be exploited, but a strength that made them nearly impossible to defeat. The Vorthic had spent 10,000 years preparing to fight the humans they had observed. But the moment the invasion began, those humans had disappeared, replaced by something entirely different. Faced with an impossible situation, humans had simply ignored the impossibility and started solving problems. Children had turned playground games into military tactics. Elderly citizens had converted exercise routines into combat techniques. Farmers had transformed agricultural equipment into weapons of war. Scientists had reverse-engineered alien technology in minutes. Even more disturbing, they had somehow communicated these innovations across the planet almost instantaneously, creating a global resistance network without any central coordination. The legend begins as the Vorthic fleet retreated into hyperspace, leaving Earth's orbit for the first time in 10,000 years. The aftermath of the 5-minute war began to ripple across the galaxy. The news spread faster than Vorthic ships could travel. The greatest military power in known space had been defeated by a pre-warp civilization, using improvised tactics and unconventional weapons. Other species that had lived in fear of Vorthic expansion suddenly began to reconsider their defensive strategies. If humans could defeat the Vorthic Empire in 5 minutes, using nothing but creativity and determination, what could they accomplish if they ever developed interstellar travel? Within days, the galactic community was buzzing with stories about Earth. The humans who had trained dolphins to fight underwater battles. The farmers who had turned their fields into tactical battlegrounds. The children who had defeated elite. Warriors using playground equipment. the elderly who had redirected energy weapons through martial arts. But perhaps the most telling story was about a human grandmother in Nebraska who, when faced with heavily armed alien invaders, had invited them in for cookies and milk. The Vorthic soldiers, trained for combat but completely unprepared for kindness, had been so confused by this response that they had surrendered without firing a shot. The new reality Zextar spent the journey back to the Vorthic homeworld writing his report. It was the most difficult document he had ever composed. How do you explain to an empire built on military superiority that they had been defeated by a species that didn't even have faster-than-light travel? How do you tell the Supreme Council that 10,000 years of preparation had been rendered useless in 5 minutes? But as he wrote, Zextar began to understand something profound about humanity. They hadn't defeated the Vorthic through superior technology or greater numbers. They had won because they possessed something the Vorthic had never encountered before, the ability to see possibilities where others saw only limitations. The Vorthic had looked at kitchen utensils and seen cooking tools. Humans had seen weapons. The Vorthic had looked at farm animals and seen livestock. Humans had seen an army. The Vorthic had looked at children playing games and seen irrelevant activity. Humans had seen tactical innovation. When the Vorthic fleet finally reached their homeworld and Zextar presented his report to the Supreme Council, the response was silence. For the first time in their species' history, the Vorthic faced a truth that challenged everything they believed about themselves and their place in the galaxy. They were no longer the supreme military power. They had been surpassed by a species that had never left their home solar system. And perhaps most humbling of all, they had been defeated not by human strength or human technology, but by human imagination. The 5-minute war had ended, but its consequences would reshape the galaxy for millennia to come. Humanity had announced their presence to the universe, not through conquest or expansion, but by demonstrating that sometimes the most powerful weapon is simply refusing to accept that something is impossible. As news of Earth's victory spread throughout the stars, other civilizations began to ask the same question. If humans could do this with primitive technology and no preparation, what would happen when they reached the stars? The answer, as the galaxy would soon discover, was both wonderful and terrifying in equal measure. Asterisk.